Hello, and welcome to the 37th episode of Chorus Place. I'm so glad you've chosen to join me for today's conversation. In today's episode, I will be talking about navigating loss and grief. As always, if you like what you hear, please leave a review and/or comments, follow my podcast, and tell your friends. Also, please follow the podcast page I've made on Facebook. If you'd like to contact me via email instead of a Facebook message, you can email me at corachin@mailbox.org. If you are new here, welcome. I'm your host, Cora, and I'm so excited to have you on this journey with me. Before I get into today's topic, I want to share today's truth talk. Today's truth is, even though it is hard for us as humans, God says that the death of His saints, meaning His people, is precious in His sight. The verse I think fits this the most is, "Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of His saints." That is Psalm 116, verse 15 in the English Standard Version. God wants to comfort us when we are grieving the loss of a loved one. Now, sit back, get comfortable, and enjoy today's episode. Today, I want to share my thoughts on navigating loss and grief. Grief and loss are so hard to navigate. I have unfortunately faced those feelings a few times in my own life, and I actually just did again recently as of the recording of this episode. You can go back to my most recent episode as of the current time, episode 36, if you missed it and would like to hear about it. Before I get into the topic though, I want to share something I thought of on this topic before I recorded this episode. I think that whenever we try to force people, ourselves included, to move on from grief so soon after a loss, especially if it was after a big one, that's basically like physically hurting someone or pushing them down and then expecting them to get back up immediately and be fine. That isn't okay. We need to allow time to grieve. Grief is a normal part of life, and if we don't feel that grief, that could cause other hard emotions to surface and potentially make our mental health harder too. On the other hand, we need to not continually dwell on it either, or we will get stuck then too. We can feel grief at times. It is allowed. Grief and loss are hard, and they take time to get through. When you deal with grief, what emotions do you usually face? I think I tend to feel sadness mainly. Sometimes I maybe also feel confusion or shock if it was sudden or if I wasn't expecting it. Or maybe I still feel it even if it was expected. I don't think there's really just one specific way you can or should feel grief. Grief can cause many emotions to surface. It takes time to heal after the loss of a loved one. I think the closer you were with someone, the harder it is to lose them. I wasn't really close with either of my great-grandparents that most recently passed away as of the recording of this episode, but it was still hard since I did know them. I usually talked with my great-grandma the most out of the two though. My great-grandpa had hearing aids, but still couldn't hear very well despite that, so we usually had to talk louder to be able to talk with him when we would see him. I remember that I would talk to my great-grandma on the phone every once in a while. I talked to her for the last time a couple of nights before she passed away. However, at that point in time, I didn't know that would be the last time that I would ever get to talk to her. It was hard to find out she passed away one night so soon after I had just talked to her. I actually wasn't even home with my family when I found out that she had passed away. I was working at the camp, so to not even be with my family probably made it a little harder on top of it being so soon after talking with her. If you want the deeper dive into that story, go back and listen to Camp Episode 4, where I talk about the joys and challenges from that summer. That episode was a tough one to write and record, but I think that it is so important to be vulnerable and share the good and the hard moments of life. If I don't choose to be vulnerable and talk about the hard moments, I fear that nobody or very few people will be, and then our world could become more closed off and we won't share when things are hard. We need to share when things are hard. It may not always feel like it, but I'm sure there are people who would love to talk with you in moments when you struggle. I know I definitely need to remind myself of that more often. I think so often we tend to believe that we can do things on our own and without help. But the truth is, we need to ask others for help sometimes. There are going to be things that come up in life that we will not be able to navigate on our own as easily, and that is okay. It is okay to admit that you need help. Don't think that asking for help is bad or makes you look like a failure. It actually doesn't. I have mentioned this before, but asking for help is wise and can actually really help in moments of deep struggle. Don't walk the path alone. Find someone you can talk to when you need help. If you don't, that could lead you down a hard path that you won't be able to get off of on your own. I know from past experiences that the grief after a loss does eventually lessen, though. I think the grief in different situations may always be with me, but it will eventually happen less and less frequently. Sometimes, it may feel like some people already want you to be moving on with life from a loss, even when it has only been a short time since then. I feel like people, myself included, should be allowed to feel whatever it is we feel until we feel like we are ready to proceed with life. Loss isn't always something you can just move on from immediately after it happens. It takes time to heal and to process. It's okay to take time to process the loss and feel the feelings you have. What I would warn against, however, is to continually stay in that place for long periods of time. Grieving for a little while is okay at first, but I think there comes a point where grieving for an extended period of time can be problematic or cause underlying issues like depression or anxiety to get worse. I am not a medical professional, so if you feel like you are struggling with anxiety or depression from grief, or just those things in general, please reach out to a doctor or a counselor who can help you more than I could. I would still be happy to talk with you though, or even to direct you to someone that can help. I just wanted to make sure I made you aware of the fact that I am not a medical professional. Grief is kind of a strange thing. There will be some times where the grief you feel will be extremely painful, and then there will be other times where it isn't so strong. The frequency of it will also decrease with time. These things can be really tricky to keep in mind when you are in the middle of processing a loss, but it can also be helpful. I don't really think grief ever truly goes away completely, but it does eventually get better with time. There might be times where it hits randomly and out of nowhere. It's important to not isolate yourself during grief. You need to surround yourself with people who will help and encourage you. I know it might seem hard to do that, but I think that being around people in that time will be more helpful than isolating. It's okay to want to be alone sometimes, but please be careful to make sure you aren't spending all of your time alone. I often need to remind myself of these things in my own life. Not just when dealing with grief and loss, though. Also, just whenever I'm having a hard day or a hard week. Now that we have spent some time talking about grief and loss because of the death of a loved one, I want to talk for a little while about grief and loss in relationships where people are still alive. You may be wondering what situations I could be referring to. Well, I'll tell you right now. I'm referring to situations such as when a friendship fades or breaks, when a family member wanders away, like the prodigal son story in Luke 15, verses 11 to 32, or when someone walks away from faith. Another example could be like when a friend or loved one faces a sudden health diagnosis, like cancer or maybe a mental issue. I hope this episode is able to offer you hope and encouragement if you are struggling with grief right now. Grief is hard, and we shouldn't go through it alone. We should surround ourselves with community when we are struggling with grief. Don't isolate yourself in times of grief. If you isolate yourself in those times, that could lead to mental health struggles. Now, to close out this episode, I want to share something with you all that I need all the help I can get on it. I know I shared this in the last episode, but want to share it here just in case you missed last week's or are just tuning in for the first time. I want to continue to use this podcast to spread the gospel and spread the hope of Jesus. But to do that, I need your help. More details to come in just a second, so stay tuned and don't go away. This might sound a little like an ad, but if you enjoyed this episode, can you please send this podcast, either just this episode or the whole podcast, to all of your friends and family and have them listen to it and then follow the podcast? I want this podcast to reach as many places as possible so then more people can hear about the hope we have in Jesus. We need the hope of Jesus in today's world. I need your help in order to spread this podcast. I cannot do this without all of you helping. I want to see if I can get at least one person from all 50 states to listen and share this podcast, and also from as many countries as possible too. Unless I miscounted, I currently have 21 of the 50 states as of the recording of this episode. If you want more info on what states I still want to find listeners from, please contact me to let me know, and I would be happy to send you a list of the states I still need listeners from. I want to reach as many people as possible and get as many followers on my podcast as I can, as well, so I can reach even more people with hope and encouragement. I know some choose to listen on YouTube rather than Spotify though, but I can keep track of states better through Spotify for podcasters. I'm not sure if I can keep track of what states I have listeners in on YouTube though. It would mean so much to me if I could get even more listeners of the podcast. I want to get as many as possible. I know some people don't listen to podcasts, but I would really appreciate it if you would share it with your friends. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please follow, leave a comment, and a review of my podcast if you haven't already, and please follow my podcast page on Facebook so you never miss an update. If you have any verses you'd like me to read on a future episode, or if you have any topics you'd like me to talk about, you can email me at corachin@mailbox.org, send me a message on my podcast page on Facebook, or a voice message through the link in the show notes, and I will get back to you when I can. Hope you tune in next week for the 38th episode.